Hello Unity team. Today we're going to start making this Unity VR room a little bit more interactive by learning to create buttons and locomotion strategy, a way to move. So first things first, I think we need to see some kind of representation of our controllers. Um, there are a number of ways to do this, and you can actually get some really sophisticated controller and hand models by adding the Steam VR asset from the asset store, but that comes with a whole lot more complications, and for the specific purpose of my tutorials right now, this is for a class where most of our students don't have headsets and controllers at home. I think it's just going to overcomplicate things. So for right now, we're going to stick with as simple a controller model as you can get, just something nice and easy to build in Unity. I'm going to make a 3D object, and I'm going to make it a cylinder. And the first thing that I want to point out as this pops in, just because of perhaps where my 3D cursor was last or whatever, sometimes when you make a new game object, it comes in with a position that is not at the origin. This will be a problem for you if you attach this, say, to your controller, and then you're like, hey, where is it? Where'd it go? Well, where it is -2, -10, -43 away from your controller. So maybe there could be a use case where you'd want something a little bit offset, but you want to do that on purpose. You want to know where things are. So we're going to start zeroing this out. Now all of a sudden you've got a big giant cylinder, and so I want to give this a more reasonable size, and I've sort of already tested this out to find out the size through trial and error that I liked. So we're gonna do, just trust me on this one, 0.05 underscale for X, 0.08 underscale for Y, and 0.05 underscale for Z. The other thing that we're gonna wanna do here is rotate the cylinder, because it feels sort of awkward when your hand is represented by like a cylinder that's pointing the wrong way. So what I found for the controllers I was using was -45 on the X felt the most like holding a controller in my hand. So with that sort of preset, the cylinder is going to be renamed to, let's call it controller model. And I think it's, in general, it's kind of good practice not to use spaces in these names. Mostly comes in useful if you get into programming with Unity. But anyway, so it's controller model. And then I'm going to duplicate it once. So Control D, because we're going to have two of these things, one for each controller. Last thing I guess I could do is make a material for it. So create, and then the material. Couldn't find it for a sec. I'm just going to call it black, and I'm going to make it black. And so we're going to apply that black material to both our controller models. Now, what we want this to do is stand in for as a visual representation of our controller, and so we need something that tracks the movement of our controller. And remember, we made a tracked alias to do that. So we can twirl this open and attach one of these as a child underneath the left controller alias, and one of them as a child underneath the right controller alias. Now, my goal is to do two things today in this tutorial and the next one. We're going to have a flashlight that we can turn on and off with a button on our right hand, and then we're going to have a teleportation pointer where we can teleport to different areas on our left hand. And the reason is we'll learn how to make buttons with the flashlight, and then we'll use that knowledge of how to make buttons in the teleport tutorial, which we'll do next. So there's one more thing we need to do before we can start our flashlight, and that's make a light. So we're going to right click in our hierarchy and choose light. And in this case, I'm going to choose spotlight. And the spotlight will also become childed. We're going to child it under the controller model. And the settings I want to make this work are rotation of 90 on the x-axis, so it comes out the front of the controller. And then I liked an intensity of 1.5 because this is a rather bright scene, so I just need to be able to see it. You can putz with any of that stuff to see what works best for you. So let's fire that up and make sure it works. Hey, now we've got a flashlight. And in simulated camera rig, if you hold your 3 button down, your mouse will control the right controller, and you should be able to see your flashlight moving around. You can also even do WASD while holding 3 to kind of move your flashlight all over the map. So this is what we're leveraging to get away with not having controllers and headsets at home. You can use this sort of janky but kind of powerful simulated camera rig to move these controllers all around. And the keys that control this are all in that simulator key bindings up there on the left. I hit escape to get out of the simulated camera rig and then turn off play to get back here. Okay, so now we've got a flashlight, but we still have to make it turn on and off. That's basically my excuse to teach you how buttons work, because we're going to be using buttons later to teleport and to interact and things like that. So the next thing I want to do is just a little bit of housekeeping, because there's so much junk now that I'm having a hard time navigating around. So yet again, we're going to create an empty object, and I'm just going to type like world and put literally everything that is part of the visual world. So all the beds, all the trees, and all of the 3D objects that I made under world, and just twirl it closed because I'm sick of looking at it. And then we can twirl it back open when we need it. Okay, phew, I feel so much more zen now. So next we're going to make this flashlight turn on and off. And the way we're going to do that is create an empty game object, and I'm going to call it flashlight button. And in flashlight button, I'm going to add a component called Boolean action. And what Boolean means is this is like a programming or logic term. It's a variable that can be either true or false. And so we want to set up a Boolean action, a true or false action, for whether a button is being pressed. Is it being is it being pressed, true or false? So that's what we're after here. And then we need to get our input mappings from our VR controllers. And that is down in packages, then camera rig, Unity XR camera rig, and then there's a folder called input mappings. Now we have 4 objects here, and if you can't read them because of the way your interface is set up, you can slide this little magnifier down to make the icons so small that they just become a list. And now we're going to be grabbing the Unity XR OpenVR left controller and OpenVR right controller, and we will drag those into our hierarchy. So these are going to have all of the buttons that can be pressed on a general VR controller. And this OpenVR thing, this is an attempt by the industry to have sort of like a standard that everything goes by. Now, if we're following along, now I'm going to bring up the VRTK Academy how-to guides, because this is essentially what I'm following along with for these tutorials. I'm adapting from tutorials in actions, pointers, and locomotion this week. Under actions, we're going to check out, I'll basically follow along with creating proxy actions, which kind of does the Unity button action already. If you look at the Unity button action, it starts by us dragging in those OpenXR controls, and then it turns on and off, in this case, the floor. I don't think that's particularly useful for us to be turning on and off the floor, only to skip that and go do something else in a second. So so we're going to turn on and off our flashlight instead. And to do that, we're going to jump ahead to creating proxy actions. Okay, so we've done step 1. We built a game object and made it our flashlight button instead of their floor toggler. And then we put a Boolean action script in there. We are now going to set up what that Boolean action script does. So what this is telling us is when we activate this condition, that is to say the button press that we're going to hook up in a minute, we're going to turn on the light, and then when we deactivate, we're going to turn off the light. So I'll walk you through how to do that. On the flashlight button, under Boolean action script, we have this activated section, and it says the list is empty. So we're going to hit the plus to add something to the list. What we're going to add is the spotlight game object, which if you twirled all this closed, it was under tracked alias and then right controller and then spotlight. We're going to throw that in here where it says none and it's looking for an object. So okay, we got the spotlight in there, but right now we don't do anything to it yet. It says no function. So we're going to pull this down, choose game object, and we're going way down to the bottom, set active. And instead of setting active and just leaving it there, notice that there's this tiny little checkbox that popped up. We want to click that, because what we're saying is when this true or false script gets activated, what we're going to do is set the active condition, which is this checkbox, does this object matter in the game? Does it get rendered? We're going to set it to checked, yes, active. And then when we deactivate this condition, that is to say pressing the button, we're going to do the exact same thing in reverse. So spotlight, game object, set active, but we're going to leave this unchecked, right? So I know this is a little like screwy. This is like makes your brain flip over a little bit. But this, I think, is one of the principles you have to get your head around in Unity, because it comes from a programming perspective. So it's like every single aspect or parameter can be independently addressed and needs to be, set to something. So basically what we're saying is this little tool is going to have an action on it that's either true or false. When that action becomes true, then we're going to say, hey, spotlight, your active checkbox, turn it on. When this condition becomes false, we're going to say, hey, spotlight, your active condition, uncheck it, turn it off. All right, so we're almost all the way there. The only problem is we don't have any button, right? Like this thing is expecting a button to be pressed, and there's no button to be pressed. So that we do under sources. And for our purpose today, we're going to have 2 buttons that do this. So instead of 0, we're going to type 2 and hit enter, and it's waiting for what these buttons are. This is where our Unity XR OpenVR controllers matter. So I'm going to have us use the right controller outer face button, which is button 1 in the Unity XR lingo. And you can see that list of controls on Unity's manual, and I can link this page on our Blackboard and in the video description. Each controller type for all the major VR controllers is listed here, and they all have slightly different button configurations, but these are the numbers that Unity uses for them. So we're going to be using button 1, which is A on my Oculus Rift S, which is what I'm testing with. If you have a headset at home and you want to mess with which buttons you're choosing here, you might find it useful to look at this input map. But for now, if you don't have a headset at home, don't worry about what I just said, and we'll just move forward with button 1 being what we turn our flashlight on and off with. Now, why do I have 2 buttons? This is for those of us who are going to test without a headset. We're going to have the simulated camera rig buttons also do this. So under VRTK camera setup, remember we had a simulated camera rig. And under that, if you don't have a twirled open, there is a thing called input mappings. And under that, we have a thing called button control. And in there, I would like you to grab button 1 and drag it and throw it as our second element here. So element 0 is press 1 from the Unity XR controller. Element 1 is button 1 from the simulated camera rig. Phew. Now after all that, what this should do when we hit play is allow me to turn off and on the flashlight based on whether I'm pressing or releasing the button. Sweet. And then if I hop out to simulated camera rig and hold 3 to move my controller around, the left click on my mouse should do the same thing. Sweet. Okay, So the reason that we did it that way, with what we're calling proxy actions in VRTK, the reason we used that is that we now know that if one of these buttons works, the other one does, right? So by making both buttons perform the same action, you can sort of guarantee that even though you can't test this on a true headset, if it works in the simulated rig, it most likely works on a real controller. So that's part of the power of VRTK's simulated camera rig for those of us who have to work even temporarily without a headset to test. So in the next tutorial, we're going to take this even further and using those same kind of proxy actions with buttons, make a pointer and a teleporter so that eventual headset users of our VR experience can teleport around the space beyond just the bounds of whatever room they happen to be viewing it in.